Welcome to another episode of the Monte and Wolf Show, KFE as it's known among the true fans. We've
Fan.
got two big matchups this last week. We did see T1, as expected, beat Gen.G, despite what people on the internet were telling me that I somehow predicted Gen.G to win, which I never did. I just said that I thought it was possible that they could win. Apparently, that means I think that they can win for sure. It was an expected result. I think 3-1 was a pretty reasonable prediction for the scoreline. And also, it was a pretty tight series between the games too. I mean, Gen.G certainly had the opportunity to win game number 2 of this series, probably should have won game number 2 of this series. And then we had KT versus Hanwha. Finally, Hanwha will curse us no longer. I hope Viper gets a new team / teammates. He won't though, because it's Korea and nobody ever actually makes mid-year transfers. So I think he's just doomed for the rest of this year. But it was fun to see him try and hard carry that team over KT.
Yeah, I guess we can talk about the Hanwha series first. That series was not good, and it was really unfortunate for Viper because he was literally 1v9ing in every single game. Nothing was ever his fault. He was doing insane amounts of damage, even in losses. And if you were a HLE fan, you're watching going like, every time you're like, holy shit, can he do it? You're not like, can they do it? You're like, can he do it? Like, is it possible? Is it winnable?
Why did they let him have Zeri?
Like, it's like, holy fuck, like maybe he could do it. Like maybe it's gonna happen. The game that was the most telling for me that like there's no hope for Hanwha for the rest of this year was the game where Zeka went 0-4 on LeBlanc and got solo killed by a Veigar in lane. And that was that was to me when I was like, it's done. Like we've seen enough games of Zeka now to where I'm like, even your champion pool of like assassin AP mids is like falling apart. Like you can only play like the Shimada brothers now. Like you're actually now just like a Korean solo queue like Yasuo Yone 2 trick. Like
I mean, did you enjoy him like self-countering with the Ari into the Veigar too? That was a huge one because we saw that matchup quite a bit last year, especially in LPL, where Veigar would be the Ari counter pick because you can just cage her and she can't ult or move or do anything.
we saw it in the
And it's
LCK
very safe
too.
matchup too in lane.
Yeah. We saw it in the LCK. Lava was playing it. We saw like everyone knew that this was kind of a known tech that people were playing. Because you can block the Ari or you can stop her mobility, and you can just press R on her, and then she dies and she can't get away. And so there's like there are ways you can play the Ari into the Veigar, but this comp was not it. And BDD just said you guys can't play the game. You're not allowed in this series, and it was kind of gross. I also didn't like the Zillion pick that we saw into the Draven.
So
I was like, you're asking to lose the lane so hard when you have no prio on the map, and then they picked the Rise, which was really cool. I like Keen picking the Rise
yeah, that was
here.
good.
And they're like, "No, we'll pick Zillion. We got this." I,
I
it
mean,
was
the
not
Zillion
it.
pick was funny. We actually saw this in LCS as well, when it was FlyQuest versus 100 Thieves in the playoffs. And although it wasn't support Zillion, it was literally just Zillion into Veigar in the mid lane. But the problem with Zillion into Veigar in general is that when you try and chrono shift somebody, the Veigar just isn't going to burst them. And as soon as it's done, as soon as it goes away, the Veigar then kills them. Or the person with chrono shift dies, gets resurrected, and then gets immediately ulted by Veigar and killed. So it really just does nothing. It really is just so terrible into Veigar.
It's such a weird thing because when you think about the Zillion pick and the Chrono Shift, you like inherently if someone explains this idea to you, like, okay, you have a hyper carry. And if the fight goes long enough, the enemy AD carry dies for any reason, whether he's picked or you kill him with your AD carry, or your mid just pushes him out and he has to back, like he doesn't have enough health, and your AD carry lives longer, you will win the fight like 10 out of 10 times. Like if you believe this to be true, like okay, and then you're like, and there is a character that exists that if you time his ultimate, your AD carry can have a second life and come back to life and then continue to carry that fight. Like if you tell somebody that, they're like, "Oh, I'll pick that." Like that seems really strong. That seems broken. But that's not actually how League of Legends team fights work in this meta. Like if your AD carry dies, they don't come back to life and carry fights. Like 1 out of 10 fights that might happen. AD carries have GAs, and that doesn't the impact of the GA usually doesn't actually go, oh, okay, but he rezzed and then he carried the fight. Like that almost never happens. You instantly die a second time. Because if you lose a fight, it's not just because, oh, I lost my AD carry, but we're still in here. Like maybe hold on. Like if you're losing a fight, your fight is lost. And the animation of Chrono Shift in GA means that the fight will be lost even harder around that person during the
Well,
res animation. It just doesn't work that way.
Well, especially again with the Veigar, because if you see somebody die with the GA or the Chrono Shift, like I said, you can either ult them or you just put the cage on top of their body and then they just res into a stun. It's so bad.
It's like Zhonya's against Veigar also is just not that helpful, you know? It's like, all right, and now you're dead.
So yeah,
So yeah.
I thought the drafting was quite suspect in the match that we saw between Hanwha and KT. I mean, this is not surprising though. I will give out some props though. I thought Kingin had a very good series. I don't know why Kingin can only play like a god when he's faced with elimination. That seems relatively true. But he had some really good flank engages here. Outside of the game where he got surprise countered by Rise, I thought he did a pretty darn respectable job and kept his team in the mix and provided the front line that Viper needed in order to potentially carry some of these games.
Yeah. Keen's also like a known Rise player. He's played a lot of Rise throughout his career in top. And he was kind of playing it when no one else was. He made it a thing in the last 2 years. Like he's pulled it out. And there was a small meta like a few years back, maybe 2020, I think, where Rise top was kind of a thing. He was playing it a lot back then, so he knows a lot of the ways in which you have to play Rise top, which is very different from playing mid because the lane is longer and like phase rush isn't always just going to get you out of dodge in that lane because you're trying to put the pressure on, but you're way far up in the lane putting that pressure on compared to mid where you're always going to have, not always, but usually going to have prio as Rise, but you can get out of almost anything with phase rush. But he knows how to play, the top lane very well. And to the Gragas, you're going to have that perma prio. I thought the way that they controlled this, especially knowing the Zillion support bottom side, where you're like, all right, I'm gonna have control of bottom 100%.
Well,
We
that's like
should be
control
able
of
to,
mid because
yeah,
Zeka blinded the Yone, so they had an Ari, so they had basically control over the wave in all three lanes, which made it
yeah.
a
And
lot easier.
people were reacting to this game, like freaking out, being like, "But aiming isn't getting cash-ins, like his Draven isn't doing well." And I'm like, "No, it doesn't matter though. They have perma prio across the map, and he will win a fight, and he will get a kill." And it was a low kill game, which is exactly what KT wanted. Like none of the lanes can play the game as Hanwha Life, so you're like, this is the plan. And if they try to make any plays happen without prio, they'll always lose those skirmishes, and then Draven gets a cash in with his ult. Like he doesn't even have to be there. He can just impact any of those lanes if the enemy jungler Clid tries to do anything. In this case, he'll probably die. And so that was to me like the best draft we saw from KT in this series. It was a draft that really stood out to me. Like, man, they've got so much more in the tank. Keen's champion pool is so wide right now
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that KT can really do anything on red side. They're strong on blue side too, but like on red side, Keen can pull anything out, and that's so scary.
Yeah, I do think it was a little bit suspicious that they let Viper have the Zeri again when KT was blue side and kind of opted out of that pick. It was a little dangerous, and it felt like Viper might be able to carry that third game at certain points in time. But I like the confidence, and I think with KT as well, you are really seeing the value they're getting some of out of some of these picks. Like they had a very different strategy for this game than did against T1. They just felt like they really wanted to push up in the mid lane and control and roam on the map. Kind of abuse Clid. Clid abused himself in many ways. I feel bad. Like Clid looked like he was having a resurgence towards the middle of the split, and then he promptly fell off a cliff again and has returned to the form that we were very critical of early in the season.
Yeah, I mean, when your solo lanes are going as badly as they are for him too, it's hard to play the game. And then like his death before, like when he ulted BDD before the Drake fight, hard to say like why that happened. There are a few things that like he could have been trying to do with follow up there. um, where like Zeka comes in maybe, you know, to follow through, and maybe you get a follow-up charm. You have Chrono Shift, so like if Clid goes in and dies and then you get the Chrono Shift off, maybe you buy enough time for that rotation in. And maybe there was an idea there, but it just didn't look like it. And then the fight that we saw on Elder wasn't a fight at all because Clid was just up there, and then he died, and then they couldn't win the fight or smite, like because they had double smite, but it doesn't matter because your jungler isn't there. So that was like the one angle is maybe if Clid and Zeka get double smite off on the Elder after delaying on that fight with Viper, and you have Chrono Shift, like there's a lot of chaos on that fight. Maybe you just randomly get the Elder through a flip and come back in the game. That was like your one way to maybe bring this to 5, and he just died because he was way too far up, like pushing towards the objective with no vision. And they have so much pick in this comp, so you will die if you go up there, and he did. He just got Malphite ulted, and like Keen is like, I don't care about Viper. We win this now. You don't have a jungler. You have a smite, but you don't have a jungler. So, it was sad. I really feel like at this moment in time, talking about, you know, this is the end of Hanwha's tournament, right? At this moment in time, I feel like I don't think so. I don't think things are going to get better in summer because I don't think you can keep your like your 80 carry player is not happy. I don't care if he goes on an interview and says like, I actually think the team is doing fine. I'm happy. Like no one believes that. Like Viper is hard carrying this team by himself. And I don't know how long your mental can hold up going through this so many times now, especially because I think Viper also had like at the very beginning of the season was a little bit rocky, but now he is so good, and it's so obvious that he's so insanely good. And Zeka and Kingen are inconsistent. Clit is inconsistent. Life is potentially the worst support in the playoffs, right? Like Kyle has looked more consistent than him in the brief games he played. And like, how do you actually then, as Viper, continue to be this good and not give up in summer if things get hard even a little bit? And like Zeka, we've seen his champion pool. Like he's has had moments where we're like, oh look, his ear got better. Like okay, like all right, like he's widening a little bit. His Ari's really good, you know. And now he just looks like very weak on everything outside of Yone, which is a champion that doesn't get you mid prio. And so you're not like a strong point for this roster when Viper's trying to sit back and scale. I don't feel good about this team's chances. I think this team is 100% going to implode at the end of the summer season, and like this super team didn't work. It's just unfortunately not it.
I mean, we knew this super team was not going to be the best team in the league. I think that was clear. Like, it was completely unreasonable to think that Kingen and Zeka were going to be able to continue the form that they had at the World Championship. And it's not like Clid had a fantastic year last year, but we could have said the same thing about Keen, for example, or BDD. And it depends, you know, motivation can change when they return to rosters. But while we did see the rehabilitation of some of the KT's players from their previous incarnations, we did not see that same rehabilitation of Clid. And you would have thought historically that given that Clid has been a fantastic Lee Sin player earlier in his career, that this might be another meta where he could do that. But instead, he's just turned into like a bad Vi Sejuani player. And it makes it very, very difficult for this team to do anything at all on the map. So you would think that where is Dread? Where is Dread, Wolf?
Yeah, I mean, well, Dread is the only person really who could get called to replace him. The challengers player, his name is Guan. He's pretty good, but like I always have to downplay the challengers players because sometimes you see the challengers players do something crazy awesome in challengers and you're like, whoa, this guy's really good. Look at his pathing, or look at how he's finding this angle, but then you realize like challengers, the level of play in challengers is way lower than the LCK. So like, is Guan better than Clid? Might seem like it, but I don't think necessarily. I don't think he's better. But maybe you bring him up and let him play a few games, and then like scare Clid or something. There's not a whole lot else you could do besides hiring Dread because the available junglers outside of the one that you already have in your challengers team is just it doesn't exist. You're gonna have to pay a hefty buyout if you want to get a jungler from a different team. Like you know, if you wanted to grab some of the other top jungle players, like KT Rolster has a jungle player called Hambach in challengers who's very good. I think would do very well on this roster. KT's not just going to give that to you. You're going to have to pay a lot of money to get that. And Hanwha's already paid a lot of money for this roster that isn't working. I mean, look, you made playoffs and you beat T1, and they have gotten some accomplishments this season. I'm not saying they haven't done anything.
I mean, arguably they overperformed based on their start. They got top 4. That's like super legit considering that they got a higher placing than D+.
Yeah, and like the player I actually talked about this on Pog State yesterday, but the one player I think that I would, if I were Hanwha Life and somebody told me you have a small budget, get one player, I wouldn't get Dread, I wouldn't get Guon. I'd be like, there's one player for me that stands out because this team has awful shot calling. It's just so obvious. They have awful shot calling. Their decision making is really bad. Viper's just like, I carry front to back, just be a tank. I'm gonna do it. But when they go to objective fights, the shot calling is all over the place. The target selection is bad. Get Bible from D Plus's challenger team. Remember, Bible played for Dom1 briefly last year, and his shot calling was incredible, and he looked very good. I'd say take Life out, bench Life, get Bible, because Bible is benched actually on D Plus's team right now, so they're not super high on him. He's played a few times, but he's not even really on D Plus's roster right now. Loopy is playing instead. Get Bible. He's budget. Put him on this team. Have him tell these kids what to do. Like, he's younger than them, but just have him tell him what to do. Just have him shot call. And like, he's an aggressive player. It fits Viper's playstyle too. Just get this guy. Maybe that fixes this team. Because if this roster just stays the same, which knowing Korean esports, 100% nothing will change.
Of course.
And
why is that? Why is that about, all the other teams in the world will make mid-year changes, but this never seems to happen in the LCK.
I think part of this is because a lot of LCK teams are built based on, and we don't know exactly how Hanwha was built, but word on the street is like Viper was like, I really want Clid, for example. And sometimes these teams are built with like Viper's like, you can get me, but I need at least like 2 world champions or else I'm not going to play on your team. And that's like part of the stipulation for me joining. And Viper now is like stuck because he's like, I asked for these players to be on this team, potentially, right? I'm saying just from hearsay and how this often goes. I don't know if Viper specifically said I want Zeka and Kingen, but he was like, I'm only going to join your team unless you have. I'm not joining unless you have these top tier players, right? And then all these players are purchased. They are very expensive. These salaries will be paid, and then you're like, can we trade these players? Nobody's going to want them right now because they're very expensive, and can we now sink our budget even lower? Plus, as we've talked about on the show many times, usually budgets for Korean teams, especially teams that are like sports teams in Korea, like Hanwha has sports teams, they budget the year, like before the year starts, like in November, December, and they're like, that's it, that's the budget, there's no more money. I gave you a team, good luck. And like, you can't really call the company and be like, please, please, $500,000, we'll fix it. It's not looking so good. They're going to be like, no, I already gave you a budget. Ask again next year, where we will be decreasing the budget, by the way, based on your results.
It just seems so crazy because they very few teams have even called up their their challenger players, right? So I don't understand why that doesn't happen, because in LPL you see a lot more aggressive swapping of players between the amateur and the professional if things start to go badly.
Yeah. I think it's because there's a lot of reasons that we've already talked about, but there's so many fans of these players, and a lot of these rosters are built on fan bases and fan interactions and side content that's made, and I think sponsors often buy into these players are very popular. And if you pull out, let's say Zeka, for example, who was player of the year last year, then it hurts like your brand identity. And I think that the fans get upset about it as well. And then if you pull a player in and he performs very badly, then you see the fans get very angry. It's just easier to be like, oh, I guess it's not going well, and we go on and we'll see what happens with the roster next year. Because Hanwha has kind of done this thing where they're like, good roster didn't work, cheap roster. Good roster didn't work, cheap roster. Next year is definitely the cheap roster year. Like next year is definitely the 8th to 10th
I
place
don't know.
roster.
The GMing of this team was just disastrous. I think from the start, we really didn't expect. I mean, we expected this team to be top 50%, but we did not expect this team to be taking home trophies. Like, that was pretty unreasonable. And if anything, they were massively overpaying for the players. They bought so high after the World Championship, and certainly they could have done a better job assembling a team. God knows KT did with probably less money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in a team like an endemic esports org like Fnatic can just say, because they are an esports team and they have X money that exists within their space, they can go, all right, well, we'll just pull some money out and buy this player. Like, they can do that. Hanwha Life Esports is run by the Hanwha Life insurance company. They have sports teams, they have budgets, and there is no like Hanwha Life Esports budget where they could just, or like they don't exist as an entity as the esports team where they could just pull money out and be like, all right, we'll buy somebody now, we'll make this happen. So they're stuck with this, and I don't think it's going to get better. And I'm happy to be wrong. And in the middle of the spring season so far, right? Like, we were both kind of like, okay, maybe, but now I'm like, no, it's not going to happen. So I feel sad about it too, because the one player I wanted more than anyone else to join the LCK was Viper in the offseason. We got our wish, but like, we monkeys pawed it, I guess, because this is how it has to be. I wanted him to succeed more than anybody else in Korea, and he is succeeding, but his team is not. So feels bad.
All right. Well, I think that's enough. We'll talk about more KT in a few minutes. We talk about future matchups, but probably what a lot of people want to hear is us groveling over T1 some more. They looked significantly better in this series versus Gen.G than they did in their previous series. They had tightened up a lot of their gameplay. Still, Gen.G, I think, did do a good job of giving them a run for their money. Wasn't a super big fan of the Jarvan top pick that started off this series, or if I'm honest, Doran's play in general.
Yeah. So when I was watching, and I don't know if you watched like with our cast or not, but when I was watching that draft, Valdez and I both thought it was going to be Wukong top, and we were like, okay, this is probably not very good, but it seems like a nice answer. And like, Jarvan with Wukong is also very strong to shut down the Jace, and they can play around top side, and Chovy can roam. With the LeBlanc, and this could be like a really nice win condition where you shut down Zeus early. And then he was like, and then he swapped again. We're like, oh wait, he's playing Jarvan top, and like, we were like talking about the draft, as if it was Wukong top and what it could mean, and then we realized like at the last possible second, like, oh, it's like Airy Jarvan top. Like, he actually thinks he can do something here. And by the way, he could not. He could not do anything here. Like, that is walking into a lane where you have no power, period. You will not only farm at a turret, but you will be farmed. Like, you are just like, of all top utility picks where you're like just an ult button, this is not the one. Like, this is the worst possible one. I thought the draft was very bad, and it felt like an accident. Like, I there were moments in that game where I was like, why did they swap? Like, maybe like they didn't mean to do that, and we'll never know. Like, it just felt very weird. Like, you opted into no pro. You already had Lissandra into, or you had LeBlanc into Lissandra in this draft as well, where Chovy actually played very well and almost like carried the game. But you opt into basically losing everything, and you're dealing with now a Jace who has a Sejuani into like the Jarvan build. Also, like, it was a disaster. Like, that game made me feel really bad for Chovy, because he was Viper in this game. If we're gonna continue like the feeling from the last series, because he couldn't do anything. And T1 is a team where if you just give them like a free hard win, like a hard win, they'll just play around it and win the whole game around. Doesn't matter what happens on the rest of the map. Doesn't matter if Pays and Chovy are fed. You're probably going to lose because Zeus is ahead and Faker's going to play around that, and they're going to get the objectives on the top side of the map, and they're going to snowball the game. And like, even if your Aphelios gets 2 kills in the lane, which he didn't, but if you get like 2 kills in the lane, doesn't matter, because they're going to play harder around their better win condition on top, and then take away your lead on your Aphelios. That you don't have, by the way, but if you did, even like, it's just asking for a disaster. I think this draft in game 1, and the game was disastrous as a result.
I did like how T1 mixed it up though from the last series that we saw, in that there was a lot of like Gnar blind picking, and that kind of like almost made it disastrous for T1, arguably. Like, T1 should have lost that series, especially with how Game 5 was going for KT. But that also discounts the clutch factor that T1 continues to have, even in that game 2, which was extremely winnable for Gen.G. I think what's so impressive about T1 is, among many things, is that their knowledge of those timing windows that we talk about is so perfect and complete. Like we saw that Faker Lysandra engage, which was, really only possible because we saw the GenG have like no Xayah ultimates in order to dodge that. And so Faker just knows that if he claws in, flashes in, that he's going to be able to catch them or force out the Zhonya's hourglass onto the Xayah. And he's going to be able to zone them out for an extended period of time as a result. The Malphite ult can be easily handled at that juncture. And it's a really impressive play.
Yeah,
But it's
that play
impressive
was insane.
because it's impressive because not that it was mechanically difficult, because it wasn't. It's impressive because before these major objectives, they are constantly keeping track of the ultimates and summoner spells that are not there. And then they can make the perfect play around the lack of those abilities. And that is what is so crazy good about this team. Is it's not necessarily that they are the best macro team, because I think, frankly, a lot of the time they were out macroed by Gen.G in this series. Like Gen.G was very deliberately playing away from Drake and into the top side of the map to funnel gold onto Chovy. They were playing around Heralds. Like they wanted to come into the third and fourth Drake fights with a several thousand gold lead. And they did a lot of the
Yep.
time. And people will lament the fact that they were giving up these Drakes, but that's not why they lost. Like, in fact, they were getting good gold advantages as a result of that. The problem is then in the lead up to the fights that they wanted to take with the gold advantage, T1 is so good at blowing your sums or your ults, and then you come into that fight and they have an instant read on how they're going to play out that team fight. They're
And
just
Faker
very
just
good at team fighting.
he trusts his team so much, and we've been talking about this forever. But like that Lysandra engage too, Genji's positioning is basically perfectly spaced for the claw, but he's flashing into it. And like that was the moment where you're like, okay, as Genji, you're like, oh right, like he actually has a longer engage than what we were kind of playing around. And the follow up is just so instant from all of his team. He's got an R, they have a Fed 80 carry, they're gonna pop off. And if you are the one who dictates the pace of that engage, the Malphite threat for your 80 carry just disappears because you're actually dictating the pace of this fight. Whereas normally the 80 carry has to kind of sit back and like watch out for the Malphite ult. Do we have enough? Do we have a read on where the Malphite is? What angle is he taking? Is he gonna like flash a wall and take a crazy side angle that we can't deal with, and then we lose our 80 carry and we lose the fight because that's how this meta has gone. The Malphite isn't just randomly stronger or way better than he was in the past. People have just realized that we have these glass cannon 80 carries in this meta right now that do so much damage that Malphite could just click on them and win the fight. And so it's really difficult, especially on low mobility 80 carries like Aphelios, to actually play around that. But if you just dictate how the fight starts every time perfectly and everyone's on the same page, Malphite like seems weak actually,
Well,
because
yeah,
he
I
can't
mean, that's
control
what
that.
Faker did. Is if you zone everybody out during the Malphite ult and there's no follow up, well, it doesn't matter that he hits Gumayusi on Aphelios. And I think Gumayusi played a very, very good series also. I
Yeah,
mean,
he
I
was
think
so
Faker,
good.
Keria, and Gumayusi were all extremely good this series.
Guma's play has been, like we've talked about how he has often been carried by Keria in the lane and stuff like that, but when it has been more about the 80 carry, like has been in playoffs, he has shown up in a big way, and it kind of reminds me of his Worlds performance where we were like, "Wow, this is
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
Pete Kuma." He just seems to be so in form right now. And when I watch his positioning on Aphelios just seems better than everybody else's. He's maximizing damage. His guns are always set on red white when he needs them to be in these really important team fights. It's hard to say he's done anything wrong. It's almost perfect play that we're seeing from him, and it's just so terrifying when you consider that he and his team make Malphite, which is the number one enemy of Aphelios right now in this meta, seems so weak and so feeble almost. And I think Doran was not the best Malphite we've seen. I think Keen is going to be a much bigger threat potentially if they match up again on this pick.
Yeah.
But Doran, as you said at the beginning of this, did kind of have an off series. Didn't look very great. Like didn't look great. The Jarvan game we can forgive because I mean, what are you going to do? But his Malphite performances outside of that, it's hard to know if it's he's looking bad or T1 are looking so good against him. But it didn't seem like it was very threatening. And if I'm T1 playing against them again in the finals, which could happen, I'm not worried about the Malphite pick at all because we've dealt with it so consistently already once in a best of 5.
Yeah, and I think they had a good read too on Gen.G, which is that the Cassante just kind of ran over the last series that Gen.G played versus Hanwha, and that's a flex pick for that's a flex pick because Chovy has had a lot of success in mid lane with it as well. So you just don't want them to have that. So I agreed that the Cassante permaban from T1, if you're not going to play it, just don't let them have it. It's too weird, especially if they're on red side when you don't know whether it's going to be coming in the mid lane or not. And then they also just banned the Zeri all the games, which is, I think, smart. Unfortunately for T1, that is one of their weaknesses, and all the remaining teams in the playoffs have excellent Zeri players that you cannot let have Zeri. So
They dealt with the Malphite also with the there was that fight we talked about with Faker that was just really good positioning from Guma, but the Silas top tech from Zeus was also really cool.
yep.
And he was super low econ that game, like he wasn't having a great start to the game. And the Olaf pick from Peanut was actually pretty interesting and it worked out decently well. Like they overextended quite a few times there and it did come back to bite them, but the fact that he was actually getting into the backline and finding access with Rakan ult in some of those team fights was crazy. He was playing the Malphite ults and the engages there so well that this is another threat that you have to consider when Malphite is picked. Like T1, I don't think they really showed their hand so much, but they showed that they have answers to some of these really strong meta picks right now. And it feels like in a weird way, maybe the KT series was a wake up call for T1, and they came in so well prepared for this. They had a completely different meta read going to this best of 5, and it's while before this series, I think you definitely could have had the belief that GenG could win, and I said this as well. Like if T1 just was like, oh, a bit of an off series against KT, and they kind of are like, it's fine, we'll just play the same style and continue to do well and keep doing our thing, then I think they might have lost to GenG here. But they absolutely did not do that. They prepared insanely well. They had reads for what GenG was going to do. They permabanned, as you said, the Cassante. And they looked like they were like super well prepared and they respected GenG so much. Because it was obviously T1 was favored, right? But they respected GenG so much. And that's just really scary, especially when you consider the team that has to play against them in the finals will play a best of 5 the day before. T1 will not have to do that. Will not have to prepare for an additional series and can just watch that run. Like they have obviously been able to watch KT yesterday, get an idea about them if they win, and then we'll watch them against GenG. If they beat GenG, you're like, well, I already beat GenG. I know their style. Now I know what KT is going to do. We can prepare for that. So T1 has all the cards right now.
Yeah. And, I was a little bit concerned about that Silas pick. It worked well, I think, because GenG was opting into some pretty bad skirmishes and seemed really nervous in some of those engagements. Because I really like GenG's draft, but also, I mean, you look at the bans that GenG had, they took out the Renata Glask, they took out the Lissandra, and then what does T1 come up with? Of course, it's Keria back on the Tahm Kench. It's a pick we haven't seen from him in quite a long time, but he is very famous for. And it's just perfect because they had this composition with Olaf, with Rakan, with Malphite that had insane backline access. Like the whole point was to shut down Gumayusi and Faker in that back line. And it was answered just really perfectly by Keria. And I think it can be expected that T1 would do that, but GenG kind of walked into it all the same. They were trying to deny the counter engaged champions, and it was still the Tahm Kench there. So
Yeah. Uh, I don't know. It feels like we started the playoffs thinking T1 is inevitable. They're going to win this tournament, and I was saying like they might not drop games. We know now that was pretty crazy to say. But I was so high on T1 before playoffs. I was like they might not drop a game. But that was in some ways my way of saying like there's no way they don't win it. Then they almost lost to KT, And I think if the coaching staff and Faker and everybody who prepared did the work to prepare for this Gen.G series wasn't as diligent, like they might not have won the series as convincingly. We might be like, oh, who knows who's going to win? But now I feel confident again that T1 is going to win, regardless of who wins between Gen.G and
Yeah,
KT.
the KT one, I think it was first off just like straight up a mistake to pick KT. Like that was really baffling, especially now that the dust has settled and Hanwha has been eliminated, right? Like that seems really crazy in retrospect. But also, I think they just weren't very well prepared for KT. They said that too themselves, I believe.
Yeah,
And it felt like they were much more ready for what Gen.G had to throw at them in this series. And what I like about T1, and we've seen this before throughout the regular season, is that when they have a read on a team, they will just continue to ban champions, the same champions, regardless of the meta. Like Cassante is not worth banning on both red and blue side in all your games, but they're going to take it out of the pool, right? Zeri probably isn't worth banning on both red and blue sides, but they're going to take it out of the pool. So these are they identify a team style and then they force you to beat them in a different way. And I think Gen.G did have some really creative solutions to these problems, but they looked less comfortable playing them. And I think that was the big problem. I think game 2 was extremely winnable. I think game 4 was potentially very winnable if they
yeah,
hadn't
I thought
lost
so
their
too.
heads. I mean, they played badly with that composition in game 4. Like it
Yeah.
wasn't a close game, but I think the tools existed for Gen.G to win.
You could definitely see the angles for what they were trying to do, and you could see that the Olaf pick actually, while it seemed a little bit troll, I think to a lot of people, is insanely strong. And if you can play these skirmishes really well, and if Carrier plays even slightly worse, then I think you win a lot of these. Olaf gets kind of fed, and then he just runs around the map, and you just fight nonstop, and Olaf is unkillable. And he had an early gore drinker, and he was doing work. Like it was crazy what Peanut was able to accomplish. There's a lot of time with Olaf, you just go stride breaker and you're like trying to be this brawly battle tank that kind of sets up the rest of the team. But he was like, no, I'm just going to live forever and my team will pop off. It's just another way to empower Pays, and that's like Gen.G's identity, right? A lot of the time, it's just like Pays is going to carry. And in the past with Ruler, that was kind of what they did too. And I think Pays has lived up to the hype. He's a very good AD carry player, but when teams dismantle the plan and he can't pop off, obviously he looks weaker. Not individually, but like his ability to actually carry the games is worse when the enemy team has map control and he can't 5v5 front to back team fight because there are problems happening in the front line or flanks are being set up he can't deal with and he just has to play defensively. And then he'll have a scoreline like 0-2-2, which is a scoreline in that final game. Like it's a tough one. I guess we should talk about now KT versus Gen.G and what our expectations are for that series, because this one is a very tough one to call.
Yeah.
Uh,
I don't think BDD is going to get away with the Twisted Fate versus Chovy. I think what we learned throughout the season and especially during these playoffs is that Gen.G is perfectly willing to blind pick the LeBlanc for Chovy. Now, if you want to ban that, that becomes an option, right, for you, but it does take a ban that may not be super impactful out of the pool. I think Chovy played very well over the course of the series against T1. Um, and like I, I I would not necessarily want to play into like a losing matchup like that. So the question is like, is that going to neutralize BDD style? Because so much of KT, at least with their pick compositions, have been BDD onto Leah or BDD onto Twisted Fate. So what does that mean if he's pushed in, and what can KT do to activate themselves on the map? I think the
I
other
think
thing
he.
that's
Go ahead.
disturbing for KT is that Gen.G really likes to play through bot lane, and they were unable to do that simply because T1 is better at playing through bot lane. And Keria was absolutely phenomenal on this Thresh pick for several games in this series. But KT is not a team that typically plays through bot lane. Like they kind of lose bot lane gracefully, and then aiming pops off later in the game. So if Gen.G has the push in mid and they have the lane advantage in mid and they're pushing through bot as a result, what is KT's win condition? It just feels like Keen has to go absolutely crazy in that circumstance.
KT right now kind of reminds me of 2020 Damwon, where you're like playing with mid and top prio a lot of the time, and then what Ghost was for Damwon back then, aiming is for KT, where he's not gonna mess up the lane, usually, generally speaking. He's not going to die like and get duo killed in a 2v2. But he's not going to be that impactful either. And they showed some extra depth with him, I think, in the series that they just played against Hanwha, where he was playing Draven, for example, which is not that type of style. Like, he was able to get control of that lane while they were controlling mid and top. KT plays for prio because Cuz needs it, because in games where Cuz has no prio, he kind of turns into a potato. But if he has prio, like, he actually does a lot of stuff aggressively and gets control of top side. He'll, take away flashes in mid, and then he can comfortably. He seems very comfortable in 3v3ing to get aiming scaled and farmed up when they're winning everywhere else. So I think this series is going to go down to, will Chovy get mid prio away from BDD, because BDD is getting lane prio in matchups that it's kind of absurd that he's getting it in. Like, he's playing Veigar and solo killing LeBlanc. A lot of that was on Zeka, right? But BDD is, in my opinion, I think BDD right now has the best early game laning of any of our mids that are left in this tournament. I think Chovy out in side lanes, Chovy will. I would give the edge to him. I will give Chovy the edge in clutch factor in team fights. I think Chovy has been more impactful in every important team fight than BDD has been. But BDD is playing a lot more utility, whereas Chovy's kind of hard carrying a lot of these fights. And I think that if they get early game control with BDD on and any pick, whether it's the Veigar pick, he just continues to get control. If it's Talia, which is not doing well right now, it's like 0-7 in playoffs or something like that. Doesn't matter if he gets control there. I think that's good for KT, and they have to have these controls over prio. I think topside, you can trust that Keen will beat Doran, almost any matchup. In the past, I would even say, like, Keen versus Doran feels like it's a bad matchup for Keen because Doran is so rock solid on tanks, and Keen is a really aggressive top laner who likes to get lane prio and play these picks like Gwen, for example. He likes to play Camille. He will play Aurelia, and that doesn't feel like a good win condition against Doran. But now he's like, I'm also good at tanks, by the way. I'm an insane tank player too. So now he's like scissors and rock, whereas Doran's only rock. I feel like the top side of the map, I trust a lot for KT. Bottom side, I think, is where things can go very wrong, because aiming is very rarely a playmaker. Lehens can set him up sometimes, but Lehens is just roaming, and aiming is left on an island. And if that gets punished, KT fall apart, I think. So if Chovy is winning mid and he gets counter picks and he's actually ahead in mid, then Lehens can't roam and aiming needs to be babysat, and then the top side of the map falls apart, and then KT can't play like they normally do.
Well, it's also that if we go back to the last matchup, which happened in week 7, I mean, at the time, it was the first 2 games were really, like, one game was very dominant for GenG, one game was a little bit closer, but still pretty dominant for KT. And then the final game was the BDD picks the Twisted Fate into the blind pick Akali. But that was the first time I think BDD had played the Twisted Fate. So it was a surprise. Like, it felt like an intentional counter pick. And then BDD went on this string of then picking the Twisted Fate more and more times, picking into playoffs right now. So it's a known quantity that you're going to be drafting around. It's no longer the shock factor. So I guess the question is there going to be a BDD champion that arrives in this mid lane matchup that's going to have the same destabilizing effect on GenG? Because that was a pretty hard out draft that KT had in that third game of the series. And it feels like that may not be occurring necessarily again.
Yeah, I don't know what else he's got like that he hasn't shown, because he's been quite eclectic in his champion pool, and he's also kind of led some of the picks that have become popular. Like, he was the first person to bring Talia back and pop off with it, and everyone was playing Talia into the Azir matchup even. Azir is now not a thing, so that's unfortunate for BDD, because I think that's a pick that he's insanely good on. The one unknown for BDD is his Tristana. I don't know if he's good at it. Like, we don't know. This has been a pick that's kind of popped up a lot recently to get a lot of all-in power and win early skirmishes and have that early prio. And we don't know if he's good at it or not. He hasn't played it yet. And if he has played it in his career, like, it is a long time ago, before my time, because he has not played it in the last few years. So I don't know. Like, that's one thing I trust Chovy will pop off on it if he's given the opportunity to play it and they're playing a draft like that. I don't know if BDD will actually be able to play that, and that could be an issue. But otherwise, like I just trust him on every other meta mid pick, especially the Veigar. Like I think he's the best Veigar in the LCK. And he's shown time and time again that he will warp team fights. He will pick the right target. He will lane extremely well. He will scale up. He'll side lane pretty safely. So that's a scary pick. But yeah, I do wonder because I don't think this game is going to be about like BD transforming into Xiaohu and playing like roaming mids, and like it's not going to be like Chovy's like, oh yeah, I'll play Galio like that. We're not the series is not, in my opinion, going to devolve into that.
Just I looked it up. BDD has never played a professional game of Tristana in his entire career. So there you go, Wolf. Mystery
I
solved
didn't
on
think
that
so.
one.
I was like, that doesn't seem like a thing that he would do, and it's a more niche pick, and we didn't see it in the LCK when players like Humanoid were just spamming it across the years in LEC. Like I don't, I just don't associate him with that pick, and maybe he's good at because BD was also kind of quietly, randomly a really sick Yone player. We're like, wow, his Yone is actually insanely good, and that you have to consider that he could play it if they're playing AP jungle picks. I think Cuz is not very good at Maokai, so we're not seeing it as much here at the end of the season from KT, but I know he can play it, so that's something that I'm not worried about. But if they wanted to do something like a Tristana pick, doesn't seem as good. Maybe Chovy's down to play Kassadin, and then you have like a free lane. I think that's something that I think Kassadin's a pick that has fallen off big time because he's too slow in this meta. But if BDD just blind picks Veigar, maybe Chovy's like, well, I'll play Kassadin, and BDD will get some prio, but Chovy will stack it up and get level 16 and pop off in the late game with Pays. I could see that happening. I think the Kassadin pick definitely is something to consider. So a lot of the series is going to come down to drafting. I think a lot of it's going to come down to individual performances from the mid laners. I feel like the series will be decided based on the performances of BDD and Chovy. And
Yeah.
I'm leaning KT. Like I'm leaning KT, but like I'm like 51-49 here. And I want KT to win, I'll be honest with you guys, because I don't want to cast another Gen.G T1 finals. I don't want to do it. Just give me a different one, please.
Well, you're so biased, Wolf. Why do
I'm
you
a
want a different
biased
final?
cast. That's right.
Look,
I know
I
what
mean,
I want, and I'm not afraid to say it.
BDD can always whip out the Zoe. That's been one of his signature champions for his entire career. And even though KT wasn't super good at playing poke compositions, as we saw in Game 5 versus T1, maybe they'll be practicing it, and maybe we'll get a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, Jace Zoe is a thing. Viego is unbanned, so that's like that's your sweet spot sometimes with like the Zoe Viego, and then
Sure.
you sleep somebody, you get a pick. Viego starts popping off in the team fight. You got the Jace, and then you're just constantly setting up those resets for the Viego. That was like a comp we saw a lot when Viego was released. Um, I I want to say that this series is going 5. I want to say it's going to be a 5-game series. Gen.G has side selection because they were the higher seed going into this, so they will get to pick blue side first. And I think we'll probably, even though I think KT have some really sick drafts potentially on red side because of Keen's champion pool, I think they will always default back to blue in losses. So if you're a Gen.G fan, I think you could feel pretty confident that if it's going to be a 5-game series, Gen.G will at least have that final blue side pick in game 5, and that might be the one that pushes them over the edge. But it is really
I
tough
don't
to
know,
call.
man. The scary thing is that with Keen, like you say, his champion pool allows KT on red side to like pull out that rise, right? Or the Cassante has been a priority that was banned by T1 against Gen.G, but at the same time, if you're Keen and you feel confident that you can either go even in the early game in a Jax matchup, right? Which once Jax gets one item, turns around in Jax's favor and kind of just goes Jax's way for the rest of the game. So you really have to win hard early. And is Doran going to be able to do that? And then also, you're fine playing the Gwen into the Cassante as well.
Yeah.
So it really feels to me that either way, it's very dangerous for Gen.G. Like KT feels like the most dangerous red side team at the moment because of Keen.
Yeah. And he'll play Urgot. He will play anything. I would not be surprised. In fact, I think there's a high chance that if Doran thinks he's going to play Malphite, he'll play the Silas into it, and he will enjoy it. And like it's scary. I think that the problems that happen in KT's draft for aiming on red side that you walk into can be pretty problematic. Because if you're banning Pays Zeri, which I think you probably have to.
Yeah, you do.
Then things
Yeah,
can
for
get
sure.
messy. Also, other X factors in this series that I think have to be considered. I would not be shocked if KT plays some unusual picks for aiming, some picks that he's really good at that they haven't shown in playoffs, like aiming's Kaisa, for example, which is insanely good. Uh, Now, if Zaya is picked, like this becomes less relevant. But if they're gonna let Pays have Zeri, maybe they play Kaisa, they play a dive comp, and they play really well around that. That could be a pick. I think it could come out in the series, and with the prevalence of Malphite, and how aiming likes to lane, I think we could see Ezreal come out in this series. I think Ezreal's not in a great spot, but when you're considering all the engaged champions like Malphite, etc., that Ezreal can reposition against and play incredibly well against, and it's aiming's best champion, in my opinion, Ezreal, that's a pick I think we could see come out in this series. So I think KT are really going to have to pull out all the stops to win this one, but I think they have the tools, they have the players, and it's a meta that suits them. And so I'm like officially predicting KT, but it
Yeah, that's
is
fair.
it is going to be hard. And I think both of these teams will have to show so much to win that T1 is just laughing at the finals. Like they're like, well, doesn't matter. You guys could just show everything and beat each other up, and I'm gonna take that quick 3-0 in the
Oh, it's
finals.
not going to be a 3-0 in the
I know.
final,
I'm
please.
I'm being facetious, but from T1's perspective, like from a coaching's perspective, you're like, it's free real estate.
The thing is though, like yes, you have the information from the previous day, but you do only have, less than 24 hours to come up with a game plan against them. And the game plans have looked quite different from team to team as well. Like the teams have played against each other very differently over the course of these playoffs. Like we just saw KT like opt into, and I mean, this is smart. This is what you would expect, right? Which is that Keen is not going to play Jax. He's going to play Malphite when he has the opportunity to, because they know they need to shut down Viper, and that's the most important thing in the world. Not putting King in a dumpster and split pushing, right? You know that Hanwha Life wants to group up and have those 5 versus 5 front to back team fights because that's the only way they win games. So you need backline access in order to force that. So I think KT has done well in terms of reading those opportunities and reading their opponent. But the point is that the series went very different in terms of KT's picks than we saw in T1. They came in with a very different strategy.
So because we do this show on Mondays, the finals will have happened before, we have our next episode. So and that's,
T1 wins again.
yeah. I mean, I was just gonna say, like, that's one of the sad parts about, like, we've talked about this in the past, the format where you have like instantly the finals the next day, where people don't get to make content and discuss the finals. Feels sad because we don't know what the finals matchup is gonna be. I feel like based on, and I know it sounds like results based analysis because we saw T1 very close series against KT. We saw T1 dismantle Gen.G. I feel like KT will have a better chance against T1, but I don't think either of these teams can beat them. And I think that if T1 rematched KT, like if the bracket was different, right, and Gen.G played them close in that first series, I think they would have demolished KT the same way they demolished Gen.G because the preparation between series was so good. And now T1 has all this extra time. I just can't see a world where they get upset here unless Zeus chokes really bad. Like that's the one part where I'm like, okay, maybe there's a bit of an angle there. Um, I kind of agree with you in that I think Korea had a pretty fantastic series against Gen.G, but they're on the Korean side and even on the rest of the global team with me. Like a lot of people thought Korea had kind of an off series. They weren't really impressed with them. I think it was like not a 10 out of 10, but it was like a 9 out of 10. I thought it was fine. Um, if Zeus chokes another best of 5 and T1 don't win this series, then we have a really fun discussion about what's going to happen at MSI. Because the other thing I want to say too about the playoffs for the LCK is we got more best of 5s than usual, but teams have been a little bit shaky and rockier than expected. I think a lot of teams have had less dominant performances than what we saw in the regular season, and LCK doesn't seem like they are extremely dominant best of 5 region right now, and that could be a problem. I still think we'll probably win MSI regardless of who's going with T1, but does
I
seem
mean, it's
like,
hard to say right now because we
yeah.
haven't actually hit the good teams so far in the LPL playoff bracket, and the LPL playoff teams do like the teams step up during the playoffs typically. So I'm waiting on that. We haven't even gotten to the double elimination part of LPL yet. I have to agree though with you, Wolf. Like I would really like to see something different besides T1 versus Gen.G. And we haven't had a Telecom War final. I just looked at it since spring of 2017. Um, and we've only actually ever had what three three Telecom War finals. One of them was the famous like 2013 summer with the Ryu versus Faker, Zed versus Zed. Then we in 2015 finals we had SKT over KT, and that was the one where Faker played the mid Riven into Cassiopeia, and that was another very famous turret dive, solo turret dive by him. And the last one was 2017 in spring with it, which SKT versus KT. And guess what? SKT has won them all
Yep.
tragically.
It's like KT's legacy was carried by so many of the moments that you and Doa cast, and sometimes even like your casting, like the Faker versus Ryu moment is iconic. And I think a lot of people have heard of KT Rolster as a team. People don't watch the LCK because they know of that moment.
Well, I mean, they haven't been in international tournaments since
Yeah,
2018, so
exactly. And
it's been a while.
they went to very few of them right over the years, and I think KT's reputation is carried by some of those early years, and then of course for some of the fans, like they know them from StarCraft, or they know them from Pro League and stuff like that. So KT's like history is so old now that so many people don't know this team was once actually one of the titans in Korean esports, and for the last half a decade has been a total flop and like a shadow of its former self. And we talked about this on the show last week, the excitement you could feel, maybe not the best word, but the hype for the KT fans when they were maybe going to beat T1 was like so contagious. You could really feel it. And maybe there's a world where in that GenG series, that's the edge that KT gets, is that the fans are just so hungry for this win, and KT is feeling themselves. And between games is where you really, because you can't really hear the fans. You can kind of see them sort of depending on the stage setup at points in time. But like when you win a game and everyone's screaming and yelling, and like when you're walking backstage and like somebody's like "fuck yeah, cuz," like that's what gets you hyped, right? And if the crowd turns against Gen.G, maybe they don't win that series. But I want to see KT be able to perform on an international stage again, because there's so many cool narratives that come up with that, and there's so many different um, ways to showcase our region's depth, because instead of just the same three teams every time, I want something different, and I think we might get it. But if we get Gen.G and it's like the same old story, like that's cool too. It's fine. Like there is such a rivalry between these teams now that it is inherently hype. And Gen.G, I would say in the Western world, is easily the second most popular team. Whenever T1 and Gen.G face against each other, viewership goes through the roof. And so like that's always good. Like I'll take it. And it's gonna be a fun series to cast either way. But as a commentator who has commentated T1 now in 4 back-to-back finals, I would like to see a different guy on the other side this time. I just wanna see a
Well,
different guy.
T1 has won the majority of total finals within the 10 years of Korean League of Legends ever since they were introduced. So I think that trend is probably going to continue. We had a nice break there, though. We had three straight splits of Damwon winning.
That was cool for a little bit back then, and I was pretty tired of it back then too. I was like, "Alright, this is getting a little bit old," you know? There was the T1 Dom1 finals, which was also kind of exciting, like, "Oh, alright." Um, and then, we know how that one went, but
Well, I'm with you, Wolf. I think we all would love to see a Telecom War finals. I think given the series that already happened, it could actually be a KT victory, especially if they have just a few more tricks. Keen obviously performed very well, and there's something to be said for what happens when the strategy changes if they try and enable Zeus more, because they made Zeus's life quite difficult in the pick and ban in that series, and they certainly paid for it. On top of Keen being very dominant, Zeus also just didn't play very well, and Keen had those preferable matchups. So we'll have to wait and see. But
it's yeah, I was just gonna say it's a playoffs where if you remove Live Sandbox, if you just say like, "Alright, let's pretend that Live Sandbox doesn't exist," it was an exciting playoffs concept because you knew T1 was going to the finals. Like we all knew this, but like every single team that could face T1 would be interesting and hype and exciting. And that's kind of rare where you're like, actually, any team against T1 like maybe has a chance, except Live Sandbox. Maybe has a chance. Like there's an angle. I could see it, right?
Right.
And that's rare. And that's to me, I think the LCK's depth was there were signs of this when DRX was actually our representative, and then they won the whole thing. But like Live Sandbox last year and KT last year, maybe going to Worlds, like they were so close to going to Worlds, that was really cool. It felt like okay, we're now that we have 4 teams at Worlds, the depth of our region is really showing. And now, like I'm watching this playoffs, I'm like, oh, we're on track for like once Live Sandbox or whoever becomes the next best team, like maybe it's Kwangdong if they get their act together. The depth of this region just keeps growing, and that is so sick. Like the LCK is just such an amazing region to watch right now. Um, there are some bad regular season games. I'll give you that. Like sometimes it's very slow, very boring, but this is the region to be watching. Like I'll go full KFE for a second, but this is going to be fucking hype. It doesn't
I
matter
know.
which team is in the finals. It's going to be fucking sick.
All right, so do a final shout out for the finals. Where are you guys going to be? Which stadium are you going to be at?
It's the Jamshid Indoor Stadium, I want to say, is the
Oh, I've done a
technical.
final there before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, I think the most recent finals there was in 2019 with Griffin, if I'm not mistaken. But both the losers finals and the grand finals are going to be in the same venue. So there's no more. Lol Park is done for spring season. It's not going to be used until summer. Both finals will be at 3 p.m. So the earlier start time than normal LCK. So what you're used to for a weekend start time will be on the weekend. So that's going to be the continuation. So both Saturday and Sunday this upcoming weekend going to be on the same LCK channel as usual. I'm not going to spoil everything that's happening for the finals, but we will have 2 tricasts. So both finals will be tricast.
Excellent.
And it's going to be sick. I can promise you that the grand finals will be at least 3 games of League of Legends, and so you're going to be there for good content. There will be some cool side content as well. So
Great.
it's going to be a good night. Okay.
All right. Great.
Uh,
You sold me. All right. Well, we'll be back next week with another episode to wrap up the LCK season and pontificate about how these teams will do at MSI. We think they'll do quite well. Spoiler, because we won't have seen LPL playoffs, so we don't know. We'll see you next week.